to another series of world history and where we're taking a look at this week. Previously to today, we took a look at the Cold War and we were talking about the divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, what we're really focusing on this week and in the next couple of weeks is what happens in the rest of the world following World War II. How do countries start really developing? And we're starting to get up to more present day conversations to where you may, as a student, start to realize, like, oh, that's why I have this understanding of this area of the world that I do today. And this is why I see the things in the news that I do today, is because of some of these conversation pieces that we are going to be getting into for this week and in the next couple of weeks. So, this week we're kind of starting out by taking a look at African nations. Now, we're taking a look at Africa as a continent, and then within the week and within the next couple of days, we're really going to break down some of those more individual stories of countries rebuilding. But there's going to be a lot of common themes between these countries rebuilding, so we talk about Africa again as a continent. Now, the question I want you to keep in the back of your head while we're going through our lesson for today is, what has the world given to Africa? Okay, so keep that question in mind. So we're picking up post World War II. We know that previously to our conversation starting today, the last we had really talked about Africa was European powers dividing up the continent. We've got them claiming lands. We know that Belgium played a huge role in this with King Leopold. And again, we're just dividing it up like a piece of pie. And different European powers took colonial control over different parts of Africa. And so there's going to be a lot of long lasting influence from these Western European powers. Language, religion, culture, all playing a heavy role into some of the more traditional values that were there before Europe even played a role. So we know that this was kind of going on at this time. Much of Africa is a part of colonies that are then overseen by European powers. So we know that going into our conversation today. So after World War II, a lot of Europe, like we know already, was destructed. Okay, it was destroyed, and so a lot of the European powers, because they were short on money, they didn't have resources, they didn't have manpower to keep the colonies up. A lot of those European powers started to withdraw from Africa. Okay, now a lot of these movements by Native Africans was, you know, they were easier just as soon as they were saying, hey, we'd like independence. These marches that were happening, pretty nonviolent. It was quick, it was easy, and they were given their independence. But other parts of Africa, it was not as easy. Okay? Other movements, other calls for independence turned violent. And a lot of those problems are still present today. Now, we're going to see a lot of times these different pieces had to choose between democracy or violence. That's pretty much the path that we're going to see major parts of Africa go through as they are starting to declare their independence, become independent nations, build up their government systems, and figure out, how are we going to move on from colonialism and the European powers? Now, this was a really hard task to do because, one, how do you redraw these boundaries? There are many different cultures, many different religions, language barriers. And so, how do you just cut out, like, okay, all of a sudden this area is a country? That's really hard to do. And so, as these imaginary lines controlling what is a country versus what's the neighboring country, as those lines are getting redrawn, there was really no rhyme or reason of why a country became the drawn country that it was. And so a lot of ethnic groups were divided up into different countries. And so when you divide up countries, you're dividing up money and resources, laws. And again, no rhyme or reason. So these different neighborhoods, long standing traditions, were getting divided up. A lot of times when we're seeing this divide, it either went smoothly, like we said before, they easily transitioned into becoming a democracy, or it was violent. And it was violent because when you take leadership out of a area that was long standing, there's going to be grabs for power. And so a lot of times these countries decided, well, we want a one party system. We don't want to have multiple groups vying for power because that encourages division. And so many countries allowed for a one party system, which ends up becoming a dictatorship or is under military control. And we see a lot of coups d'etats, or coups is what they're pronounced as. More Americanized term there is the coup. And that is where you have different militarized groups or citizens toppling whoever is in control. They reestablish their government system and start all over. So, a lot of African nations were going through this cycle of they're either democracies and they're doing okay, or they become dictatorships and there's a constant coup happening every decade or so. Now, a part of the problem of European nations ending their colonialism is yes, while the government systems were coming out, they were no longer controlling things. A lot of businesses were left behind. A lot of European businesses and those resources getting managed by European powers, that was still left behind. So you have governments controlled by citizens and those that are elected by citizens, but then the money side of things, the economy, that is still very much European controlled. So there's still some gray area there of who's really helping the development of African nations. Are we truly allowing independence, or is there still a very Western style, Western control for these developing nations? Now, I wanted to show you this map because it's really interesting to see one, on the left side of this shaded part of Africa is who was in control of these different regions. And then on the right side here of the screen, you're going to see when did these different areas gain their independence. Okay, so we've got all the way from pre 1949, so kind of falling after World War II is in the purple, all the way up until the 1980s and so on. We didn't have African nations that were independent up until after the 1980s. So that's really something interesting to look at. And so, as we're also looking at this map, you have to consider which European power was in control of which areas. How could that go back to the culture, the traditions, the language, even down to the religion? Okay, so we're seeing this this patchwork system of language, tradition, and when we try to just draw these imaginative borders, it's obviously going to cause problems, which then goes back to why we're going to see these government coups happening throughout different areas of Africa. Okay, so keep this information in mind as we go in, and it may help you start to understand why there were struggles for as long as there were. Okay, so as we're talking about African nations really getting developed, it's important to keep some overall themes kind of in mind. A lot of Africa is very, very rich in natural resources. You can see the image, the picture that we got here on the top. We've got the hands kind of holding different natural resources, and then again, a map of Africa, the continent showing the different natural resources that are able to be mined out of this area. Okay, so you've got gold, copper, diamonds, coffee, cacao, which ends up being used to create chocolate, and petroleum. Okay, very, very rich. A lot of money can be made coming out of Africa. Now, the unfortunate part here again is Europe's role in these natural resources, having the equipment to mine these natural resources and then trade it throughout the world. So, Belgium primarily held the middle portion of the continent. We know that they were involved in the partitions of Africa in dividing up the continent to the different European powers. We know that from our imperialism conversations earlier in the year. While Belgium allowed for independence, they really did keep the Democratic Republic of Congo, which again is that middle portion. Okay, you're going to see kind of the diamond words there on the map in front of you. They kept control of the economy in that region. And so while there was control by Africans of the government systems and laws, Belgium still had a huge amount of control over this region of Africa because they were exporting a lot of the goods. Okay, and again, we know coming out of the Cold War, a lot of different proxy wars were happening throughout the world between the United States and the Soviet Union. As these European powers are leaving, they're leaving behind questions of what kind of government are we going to have? Are we going to develop in a communist style or a democracy? And so the Soviet Union and the United States, again, is playing a role in these countries as they're developing. Same kind of thing that happened in Asia, we're seeing happening in Africa as well. So the Soviet Union and the United States, they are supplying different regions of Africa with weapons, training, and money in order to encourage them to develop either as communist or as a democracy. And they're going to fight off against each other, these different bordering nations who maybe have these different religions, different traditions, and don't quite get along. Now they are armed by these superpowers throughout the world. And it's going to cause these long lasting tensions that we still see up to today. So, this is a theme. This is a theme that we're going to see play throughout Africa as these countries are developing. Okay, and as you know, we have a lot of divisions that are going to lead to conflict, whether it's regional, ethnic, tradition, things like that. Okay, primarily we're seeing divisions between religion as far as Christianity and Islam. Okay, that plays a huge role in Nigeria, where we have a government of one religion and maybe citizens of another. That's going to cause a major divide. And then, because of this divide, especially in Nigeria, we see oil fields coming under attack. The people who are working these oil fields and mining out these resources to make money, they actually end up even getting kidnapped. So it's a very violent scene leading back to these ethnic divisions and this fight over resources. So we're going to get more into some more specific countries. Okay, a lot of the stories are pretty similar between the different themes and conversations that we're about to get into, but we're going to focus on these ones pretty specifically. So, to get into things first, we're going to take a look at South Africa. This is a very interesting country, very beautiful terrain, but it's gone through a tough history that's not unlike our own here in the United States. Okay, so there's a part of racism that plays a major role in the politics of South Africa. Okay, this was called apartheid. Okay, apartheid was where the government, which was primarily controlled by whites, they were passing racial laws that severely restricted blacks. And the black population was the majority of the percentage of the population. And these racial laws were restrictions on marriage, travel, the type of jobs you could get into, the type of systems you could use, like transportation, very similar to segregation that we know of here in the United States. This was happening in South America up until the 1990s. Okay, so 20, 30 years ago, we had this apartheid system in place in South Africa. And there were different groups that tried to rise up. Okay, the African National Congress was one of these major groups, and their leader, Nelson Mandela, he was at first leading these missions of nonviolence and speaking up, having different marches, but because of him speaking up against the government, he ended up actually getting jailed. Okay, so while he was behind the bars in jail, he was still advocating for equality, to end apartheid, all of those different conversations. So in 1990, the South African president, because of these continued pressures on the system of apartheid, he ends up ending this system, and he lifts the ban against the African National Congress because they had been banned as well. If you were found to be a part of this system, you would be jailed. Okay, you could get killed even. And they end up freeing Mandela as well. And so in 1994, because we have this end to apartheid, to the segregation that was happening in South Africa, all races are able to vote. They become a democratic government system, and they end up electing Nelson Mandela to the presidency role. And he was well favored by the majority of citizens. Okay, so this was a struggle for a country, and they end up coming back and having this success story. Okay, so I want to make sure you guys understand that there are misconceptions that a lot of Americans have about the continent of Africa that aren't quite true anymore. Okay, and I actually specifically included an image in the bottom right hand corner of our presentation today of more of the terrain and what we're seeing for this region of the world. Okay, it is beautiful, it's luscious, it's very well developed city wise. Okay, so keep that in mind of like these misconceptions that we potentially have as students. Now, while we have these different success stories of countries becoming democracies, having a fair vote, seeing again these success stories, there are still struggles that are happening. Okay, so we're going to take a look at genocides that primarily occurred in the 1990s. The first being Rwanda. Okay, the Rwandan genocide was a really horrible act that happened and ended up killing millions. Now, this happened after Rwanda ended up gaining independence, but there were a lot of ethnic divides. Okay, there were two different cultures in Rwanda between the Hutus and Tutsis. Okay, they had different traditions, different ideals, long standing ideals. Like, this is not just like popped up like all of a sudden we have these two different social groups. No, centuries old traditions and a divide between these traditions in Rwanda. Okay, now the Hutu officials, they were the ones that were in control of the government. And because of these different divides between the two ethnic groups, they were urging citizens to go kill the Tutsis, to go kill their neighbors, and to kill anyone who was potentially a moderate Hutu. Okay, so this was a horrible act from a government over its own citizens. And because of this official claim of like go do this, we encourage this as our government because we don't agree with them. It ends up killing over 800,000 citizens, and over 3 million ended up losing their homes because of the government pushing them out, forcing the exile of anyone who didn't agree with them. In the Sudan, which is one of their neighbors, we also see these acts from the government over its citizens because of a division of ideology. Okay, so the Arab-led government ended up creating these different discrimination laws, going back to again what kind of jobs you could hold, marriage laws, travel laws, and it again led to different deaths. Because of this war, and Africa went through a major drought in the 1990s. When you have drought, a lot of your cattle or your steer are going to die. We're losing out on food for the citizens. So between the loss of food, the loss of water, the loss of homes, this war, it again caused millions of deaths. Now, this was known. On the world scale, this was events that were coming out, and people knew what was going on. And so the United Nations did end up sending aid into these regions of Africa to try to say, like, hey, we're here to help. We'll try to help end these laws and end the killings, but it really didn't stop the conflict. So let's take a look where I want us to really end this conversation on like where are African nations at today? Because again, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but when I went through high school, when I was going through my schooling, it was the conversation was kind of left at World War II of okay, Africa is divided up into these colonies and We see these images of, not great situations. We have this misconception that Africans live in huts and they aren't developed, but that's just not true. And I want to make sure that you guys don't walk away from high school with that same misconception. Today, African nations are establishing their industries. They are very much becoming developed, and they're doing it much more quickly than some of these long-standing nations that we think of today. America, England, France took centuries of years, okay, centuries to become developed to the point we are today. Africa is doing it in decades. Okay, it's amazing how quickly they're able to catch up, even due to the setbacks that were placed on them because of European powers. So, African nations are establishing these industries, they are creating these different and unique transportation systems that we don't even see here in more developed nations. They're using those resources to build up their income. They're increasing literacy by developing schools, education, universities, and they're really going back to addressing any of those rural poverty systems. Okay? Governments are using socialism a lot of the time in order to increase development in the countryside of Africa. So they encourage farmers to really develop a plot of land, bring the crop together in order to help feed people. There's also a increase in urbanization. So we're seeing people in Africa move from the more countryside into developed cities, getting these jobs in the cities. And then they're taking those innovations, that technology, and taking it back into the countryside. Okay, so using drones, using newer technology as equipment in order to create more produce, create more food, help the population. And because of this urbanization, we're actually seeing an increase of women's rights. Typically, traditionally in Africa, women were the ones that were trading in the market, in the cities. And so, as more people are moving into the cities, it's increasing the worth and increasing the rights for women and increasing their status in society. So, it's a really awesome benefit of seeing this urbanization, seeing the development of African nations. Now, as we are developing, we're seeing different nations in Africa struggle with the question of, do we want to be capitalist or do we want to be socialist? Capitalist being increasing competition, we have incentive. If you have a good business, your business is going to thrive. The harder you work, the money you get. That's one side of it, but you also have the side of socialism, of communal produce, communal goods, increasing the value for everyone. And as a developing country, what's going to be the best for you? So, some of the tough questions about this divide between capitalism and socialism for developing countries is, when you create a system with capitalism, there's the potential for foreign influence. Okay, so we see already, and we've seen this trend of like African nations want to have independence. They don't quite need those ties back to Europe anymore, and they don't want those ties. They value tradition, they value heritage, culture. And so if we have this capitalism economy, there's this potential. Are we going to have a continued, type of business colonization from European powers? Now, the problem with socialism is, if you have increased socialism, you need to have an overhead government to support this and to maintain it. So, capitalism, you have foreign influence. Socialism, you're dealing with more increased government control. We know from the beginning of our conversation today that the more government control that we see, one party systems, it potentially leads to dictatorships and coups d'etats, or a coup, which again leads to unrest. So there's really tough choices right now of what's going to be the best, what's going to bring the greatest return in the long run. Now, a conversation piece of, this urbanization developing is agriculture and deforestation. We know that the continent of Africa is very rich in their resources: gold, cacao, again, all of these crops that are bringing back money into the economy. Because of the great rich resources and soil in Africa, Actually, 9/10 of citizens in Tanzania, which is just one of the many African nations, those citizens are in agriculture. So that's where a lot of the jobs are, and it's helping out the different countries around the continent a lot. Now, because of this great agriculture business that is going, we're seeing a lot of different rainforests and long standing traditions kind of starting to fall apart. 70% of animal inhabitants, places that they live, their habitats, they've actually ended up being destroyed. And so there's this great effort right now in Africa and throughout the different countries in Africa to stop deforestation, because the more that that land is taken over for farming, the less habitats there are for the natural wildlife. And again, going back to the culture, systems. And so we have these great questions of like, what is the next steps? What route are these countries going to make? Are they going to continue to get up into agriculture? Are they going to really develop these major city systems? What kind of government are they going to have? What kind of economy are they going to have? All of these questions have kind of been answered throughout the 1990s, which leads us to these conversations of today of what's next. Okay? So, by no means is Africa underdeveloped. By no means are they just like poor children living in huts. That's not the truth. And I want to make sure you guys understand that that is a misconception. It is a myth. The fact is that they are developing. The continent as a whole is developing very quickly, but there's very hard conversations happening of like, who do we want to be? There's a lot of major religious divides, ethnic divides, language barriers that are leading to these tough questions of who are we? Okay, and so that's what we're going to take a look at. We're really investigating these kind of questions today. So, if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. I'd love to have more discussions about this with you. I look forward to seeing you guys next.